Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And welcome back to Open Your Eyes. We're moving now into our first segment, and this one is actually our COVID update courtesy of Fulltech Systems. In to talk to us is actually Dr. Marvin Manzanero. It's so nice to see him after a while. And this conversation is actually about sharing the latest info on Omicron variant. And is there, this is one of the big questions. We're not throwing that out to you as yet, Doc. But, you know, the questions actually surround, is there other variants out there? Dr. Marvin Manzanero, good morning and welcome, sir.
Hi, good morning, John. Good morning, Marlene. Unfortunately, you know, the science continues to evolve. We are now into more than 2 years into a pandemic, and where there seems to be no end in sight. But I think what we will have to hopefully be able to come to terms with is how you balance an evolving virus with our daily livelihoods. And I can't say into our normal way of living. I think it's hoping that you can establish new norms and take it on from there.
At the start of the pandemic, Doc, it was said, and this was late 2019, early 2020, that this pandemic should be finished by at least 2022, summer 2022. Are we seeing that in sight?
Unfortunately, no. I think we have come to terms that it is going to be what we are labeling as an endemic virus. Endemic simply means that it's a virus that is here to stay, that is going to become part of other viruses that are infecting persons on a routine basis, just like you have other flu viruses, you know, like when we had the swine flu, the avian flu, and then those got labeled into H1N1 and all these other types of influenza. I think that is the anticipation. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, it's been a learning process almost on a daily basis. You have to be on the lookout for what science is going to tell you. And of course, there's so much more technology and scientific advancements that allow you to be able to track a virus more routinely. And also because of social media, the information that is routinely being generated is shared much more widely. So that's why it seems to always be in the spotlight. So, you know, it's kind of like evolving with technology, it's evolving with globalization.
Sorry, yeah. I wanted to just get your feedback on something. One of the things that has happened is that Omicron has come around, spreads really rapidly, and so far, you know, luckily, we're not seeing as the amount of people in the hospital as compared to the large number of positives that are being detected. People are still losing their lives to COVID-19, but it's not, the number of positives is not equating to the severity. It has somehow allowed people to believe, one, that this may actually be the end of the pandemic. And the World Health Organization has been kind of sounding the alarm to say we're not there yet. Can you explain to us why?
Well, you see, even before we get to the why it isn't there, perhaps I know that the term that was widely thrown out is the term mild to describe it. And I think that's a wrong terminology. And I think that the term that perhaps suits it a little bit more is milder, but not mild. And the reason is because just because you're having so many cases and your vaccination rates are not high across the globe is what drives the statement now to indicate that this is not the end, because it is anticipated that the virus will continue to evolve. So any new variant that comes along will have to be more contagious or infectious than Omicron, because in order for it to take any viability, for it to continue to spread on, it will have to be much more infectious than Omicron, or else Omicron, you see, like when you had the Delta variant that seemed to spread much more quickly than the previous variants that were there. Omicron came along, is much more infectious or much more contagious than the Delta variant. So whatever other variant comes around will have to be much more infectious, and that's the reason why you can't speak of a pandemic that is end is in sight. The two things that can potentially happen with a new strain, and which you hope don't happen, is that it is not much more deadly than Omicron is, and that it doesn't evade whatever successes have been had with the vaccines that are currently in circulation. So you can anticipate that you're going to have a much more infectious strain. We are going to hope that it is not more deadly and that it isn't evading vaccines that are in circulation.
And the other option is, so what I hear from you is that what happens next is important. When there is another variant, and we were talking very briefly of the new variant detected recently. When there is another variant, it's to hope that it's not one that affects people more severely and causes more death. It's to hope that it's, like we've seen with Omicron, that it has less severe symptoms. But we have no guarantees with that, do we?
Yeah, no guarantee, and the hope would be that it just disappears, right? Because even though it can happen, but you see the issue is when you look at the numbers that seem to be overwhelming. I mean, just last week alone, there were 21 million cases of Omicron globally in 1 week, and that's a new record since the pandemic started. But when you think about it, it's the numbers are just so wide that I don't know that it will happen. I think every time it is spreading at those rates, you're just giving it more chance for a newer strain to come along. And as you have said, there is on the horizon already newer strains of Omicron starting to appear.
Yeah.
It's and that's why it can be mild, because when you have 21 million people sick, it can overwhelm health systems rather quickly. Because, I mean, if you do simple math, let's say you had 100, let's say Delta was 10 times more lethal, and this is just raw math so that we can get a grasp of how serious it can be. If with Delta, for example, you have 10% of people winding up being in a hospital, that means that out of 100 cases, 10 were in the hospital. With Omicron, let's say it's 1% hospitalization rates, but you have 1,000 cases. It's the same amount of people that will wind up being in hospital, which is why it can overwhelm the health system.
Yeah. And going back to the new variants that may come up, this is essentially the ideal situation for variants to form. Because I know you've told us, all health officials have said, the more people who have the virus, the more chances it does have to mutate.
And you have to add the uneven vaccination rates into the mix, because that also can allow for more strains to develop. Understand also that in terms of strains, for example, Omicron, what it seems to do is it has learned how to evade immunity. So you can become, and that's why it's not, the term mild makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because you can get it more than one. I mean, recall that in the initial variants, you had people saying 6 to 9 months of natural immunity is what it seems to give you. But now we are noticing that people had COVID in November, early December last year. And I just met a colleague who recovered during the first week of December and tested positive on Monday.
Wow.
So, and symptomatic, it's not just, you can't, it is a reinfection, then you can't say it is residual from what happened. Understand that variants are circulating. I recall that in our wave that we had in November, December of 2020, the Mexican group of infectology had detected that they had their own variant that they felt drove their second wave. That strain of the virus, remember, it wasn't being studied that much, never got classified into a variant of interest or variant of concern, but that is the one that caused a good amount of deaths in Mexico. And our epidemiological link for that wave was with the northern districts. And so I felt that whatever caused all those deaths in Mexico in the second wave of last towards the end of 2020 is what drove that wave here in Belize. But again, that strain was never classified.
Yeah,
so
we weren't
strains
sequencing at that time, so we wouldn't,
yeah. So strains pop up everywhere, but it's how quickly they are able to evolve contingent on population, on how that population interacts.
But
And as you said, there is another one out there now.
let's talk about the mutation of these viruses, Doc. Do they get more lethal as they continue to mutate, or do they lose a little bit of their power? How does that work?
They might not necessarily become more lethal because the virus, what the virus tries to do is establish what we would call in biology a symbiotic relationship, tries to find a mechanism where it can continue to survive in this case, the human species, but SARS-CoV-2 can be found in other species as well. So it is not convenient, if you can use that term, so people can understand perhaps, for the virus to become more lethal, because if it kills its host, then it is killing itself then. So what viruses try to do is try to establish a relationship where they are able to continue to infect others so that they are able to find hosts where they can thrive. So it isn't, so it can make a mistake, yes, make a mistake in two senses, make a mistake and so that it's not that viable and it kind of loses itself in the biology and disappears, or make a mistake so that it becomes so lethal that it kills more people, and then you don't have a host where it can thrive. So the virus will try to find a way where it can balance itself and just continue to propagate itself.
Now, one of the things that we have heard about is that perhaps, and I want to get your opinion here. We had one medical professional who had spoken about this as a possibility, that given the sharp increase in cases of persons who have now gotten COVID, that this may be a chance for us to get natural herd immunity. What's your thought on that?
I think when you review the science, herd immunity is out of the picture with Omicron, precisely because you're getting reinfected. And so the number of, if you start looking around that data, even for the Belize context, you're going to find that people who have had COVID are still getting COVID. Again, you have had people who have been vaccinated and who have had COVID are getting COVID again. And you may be asymptomatic, but it doesn't mean it has disappeared. I mean, in my case, for example, I've had COVID and I've had 2 vaccines, booster due next week. I feel every time I hear somebody has COVID and that my throat starts to itch. So I am conscious of the fact that I can be having COVID again, and that I can be perhaps an asymptomatic carrier and just passing it on to others. I don't know that the word herd immunity would, given how the virus has behaved, is going to take us anywhere.
Good. Thank you for giving us your thoughts on that. Now, I want to ask something else, because this particular wave, we're at a disadvantage that we haven't been before, which is we are facing our spike just about the same time as everyone else in the world. And before, we were a few weeks delayed, sometimes a few months delayed. So we had some indicators as to what to expect. Things, for example, like, can you get the Omicron variant more than once? I don't know if that data is available yet, because the US, for example, is just coming down from their peak, and other countries as well. What are your thoughts on that? What do we know about the end and the end of the Omicron wave?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because you are right. In other variants, you had a up to 12-week delay. So whatever, it's like a tsunami alert, if you will, that you are now told, you know what's going to come. Now it's like you don't know what's happening. You're almost getting it in real time. And so it doesn't allow you to have that surveillance data from other countries. I think it is difficult when you look at the data from other countries, because there is an advantage in that other countries started their wave before. And so you will note that the UK, for example, has decided to kind of scale down their public health measures because they feel that they have peaked and their numbers have started to come down. But just the data from the US this morning is saying that they don't anticipate that peak, even though there have been suggestions, and I think even their lead public health person, Dr. Fauci, had indicated that they felt that by February, that would kind of be the end of the epidemic for them this time around. But it doesn't seem to necessarily be so. When you look also at the Mexican data, that some days in between, one day of every week for the last 3 weeks, they have had a break in terms of their number of new daily infections. So even though it tends to be peaking, it starts to decrease, and then you have a day that it goes up again. I also don't know how people are now classifying reinfections, because I mean the waves have been just so heavily advancing that you don't, or breakthrough infections. I don't know that there's a specific classification now, especially in countries like the US, where you have now the ability to do your at-home tests, and I don't know that those are necessarily reported. And even in Belize, I have had a family of mine, a close family of mine, where 3 out of 4 adults that live in a home tested, and the 4th adult had symptoms, did not get tested. 2 children in the household also had symptoms and did not get tested. So the numbers might be a little bit more higher than what we have.
Yeah.
So,
do you think that I know that contact tracing is important, but when you have a spread like this, is it worth the resources to be doing contact tracing?
Yeah.
No, it's as much as proactive a measure as you may want to take, it's going to overwhelm your health system. So I think you just have to concentrate more on the public health measures, on the prevention, and trying to look at morbidity and mortality associated to it.
Doc, we're so hung up on Omicron. It has been in the news like wildfire, and I think that a lot of people have put now behind their mind of other variants. Do you feel, or do you know, or do you think that the other variants are actually still circulating within Belize?
Yeah, they can still be here. Recall that there's a Delta Plus also that is very similar to the Delta, but has minor mutations from that one. I was reviewing the data from the Caribbean region, and interestingly, even though they have a spike, like most other countries have, their sequencing being done for mostly Eastern Caribbean countries doesn't have Omicron as the prevalent strain. They still have Delta and Delta Plus as whatever they're identifying. So that's an interesting trend to note. But I do believe we still have the other strains in Belize.
So let me press you. Doc, I appreciate you bringing us what the science is saying and what's happening around the world, because we do have a lot of questions about COVID, and it's tough to keep up with all the information. As we started off, one of the first things we were chatting about during the break is that there is already the detection of a new variant of COVID-19. It's called the variant of interest at this point, and I think you referred to it as the Stealth OMICRON. Tell us a bit more about that, and how concerned should we be?
Yeah, the Omicron strain, that is the one that everybody's talking about, is classified as a BA 1. They have their little
it's too
codes.
technical for
Omicron
us.
is the term that's used for so that everybody can be on the same page.
Yeah.
If you will. But there is a newer strain. It's being labeled loosely as a BA2. I don't think it's been classified as any variant of interest, but it is being followed. One country has already reported that up to 60% of their samples is by this newer strain of Omicron, the BA2, and that's Denmark. It doesn't seem to have a major difference in terms of the viral strain. But the reason why it's being called Stealth Omicron, and that's, in parentheses, is because it seems that this newer strain is making it a little bit more difficult to be able to identify on routine PCR testing. And that's also something that's followed or was being followed when Omicron came into the scene. Is it going to be more lethal? Is it going to cause more hospitalization? And also, are you going to be able to detect it through the routine tests that we have? And that's one of the first things that's analyzed.
So let me understand it properly. The concern with this Stealth Omicron, this new variant detected in Europe, is that the PCR test is not recognizing the positive, that is not detecting it?
Wow.
The science is saying that it's a little bit more difficult to detect it using the routine PCRs that are being used.
Interesting.
And that's the reason why it's been labeled as stealth, because it would have the ability then to just creep up on you. And let's say you're doing PCR testing and perhaps are not detecting it, it doesn't mean you don't have it.
Yeah.
Wow. And that's one of the things that Omicron really shaked up for us here too, because the insistence now on being able to wait for the days after exposure to test or retest is one that we keep on reminding people. We hear it all around because people are getting symptoms 6, 7, 8. I know of some who've gotten symptoms almost 2 weeks after their exposure to the positive person. Why is that happening? What's the difference that allows for this to happen?
Recall that from the beginning, it had been said 2 to 14 days after exposure. For example, in my particular case, I think my significant exposure and when I developed the first symptom was at 12 days after I was significantly exposed within a hospital setting. Mm-hmm. So every person is going to be different. With Omicron, the period in which you can infect others seems to have been decreased, mm-hmm. Right? So that the majority of people were developing symptoms within 3 to 7 days after being exposed. But it can be that you can, at day 14, after being significantly exposed, mm-hmm. That's when you start developing symptoms. And it can also be that you're getting what I would label loosely as a multiple exposures, right? Let's say in day 1, 2, 3, you got exposed with different persons because you have different cases. So mm-hmm. eventually you have that measure.
So I'm looking at one positive person, maybe not knowing that I come in contact with a asymptomatic person, yeah, or an untested person at that point. Interesting. Now let's talk about contagion, though, because I know persons who 10 days after testing positive are still testing positive.
Yeah.
Can they still spread the virus?
Well, it depends on what kind of test you are using to detect the virus. Recall that if you have been positive, you can still be testing with a PCR test.
This case I'm talking about was rapid. It was a rapid 10 days later, still positive.
Then they more than likely that probably have a high viral load in the upper airway. Recall also that with Omicron, and the reason why there's a difference between Delta and the other strains is because Omicron was or is simply reproducing itself more in the upper airways, in the throat, nasal passages. And that's why most of the symptoms are in the upper airways, the sore throat, the stuffiness, more like the regular flu. But because it's there and the concentrations are higher there, it's more easier for it to spread, as opposed to Delta and the other strains that were replicating more or had the ability to reproduce themselves in the lower airways, which is why you had more lung infection. But it being lower in your lungs, for example, is not going to be so easy for it to spread. So that's also the dynamics of why one is different than the other. So it could be that it's staying in your upper airway for a longer period, and that's why you're testing positive with via rapid test. If that is still the case, you are more than likely still going to be infectious.
Okay.
We do have some questions that we've been receiving online, and the first one of those questions says here, if someone still tested positive after the 10 days quarantine,
I
Are
just
they
asked that one,
safe
yeah.
to, okay, so we
Yeah.
just did that one. It says here, does Belize have the technology to identify variants?
Yes, I understand it. They're doing sequencing. I will not be able to tell you what kind of methodology is being used in terms of, because for sure they are not going to be testing
Yeah.
every sample, but
Yeah.
there are methodologies in terms of what percentage from where and which days of the week the samples are being done.
Yeah.
There would be a process for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It also says here, how long will it take for this wave to go down?
I think it's difficult to predict. I had been reviewing the data that is routinely published. I know that in December, I had, in my own estimates, said that the week of January 17th would be when we will start having a particular surge. And I think it's going in that trend. I think for the last 2 days, the two reports are the highest number reported so far.
Yeah.
It's very dynamic because it's still going to rely on the public health measures that we know to determine whether you can make a dent in that wave.
I want to ask one more question in terms of the effects of this. It's still COVID, this new variant of COVID. Long-term COVID is expected to be the new challenge in the future. I'm trying to remember. I think you had the Alpha variant, right? And you had a long time to recover. There are persons who've had Delta who still have residual damage. Even persons who had mild infections have residual problems. And I've read, things like mental health changes, battling depression, because it's a systemic disease, and lung damage, and so many different, new conditions may develop as well. And some people are really facing a challenge after recovering from COVID. Is that still a possibility with Omicron, given the fact that it hasn't been giving people really bad symptoms?
That is very true. I'm not so sure if I had the Alpha variant. I'm still thinking that it could be that Mexican. I mean, I think I
you're
got
right, yeah.
exposed in Corozal with that Mexican strain that was never labeled.
Yeah.
But
it was
yes,
before Delta.
Way before Delta.
Yeah.
Way before vaccines too. There, and that's the reason why the term mild is, I think, misleading, because we don't know what long-term COVID is going to be with Omicron. But it is a public health measure, not in the future. I think it's a headache now, because people are starting to have fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, difficult to control high blood pressure. You know that there's now a published study that says that for children and adolescents who had COVID have a higher risk of developing diabetes type 1. Your risk is increased just by the fact that you have had. So all those things are starting to now show up in health systems. So I think it is the now, because recall that you have had people who got infected 18 months ago that are now facing those situations. So that's why it cannot be considered mildly. What is also known is that how sick you get doesn't seem to correlate to long COVID. So that you may have patients who are severely ill in the hospital who go on to have a full recovery and have no lingering symptom, where you also have people who had asymptomatic COVID, who were diagnosed as part of contact tracing in the early stages of the disease, who go on to have long COVID. And I think what's starting to be reported is that the younger working population, those people 35 to 50, or maybe even in the upper 20s, are now having these symptoms such as fatigue. People are just saying they're fatigued. And the difficult thing there is that you may run all kinds of lab tests on persons and they're all going to be normal. And how do you explain at your workplace that your functionality is not going to be the same? And brain fog, there's a clear scientific explanation for that. I mean, the virus does have a particular affinity for brain cells and spinal cord cells. So that is the reason why people do have brain fog.
Well, Doc, there is so much more. That's a topic that we definitely have to explore further. Maybe we're giving people some sort of aha moment because they may be having suspicious symptoms after recovery and not know why. Dr. Manzanero, it's been great to have you, great having you to break down some of this latest information. I do got to get in this question to understand what your latest status is. We were told you were meeting with the new minister, and there is an offer on the table.
Yes, we should meet later on this week again.
So you're considering staying with the Ministry of Health?
That's a consideration.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to share about your current status of employment?
Not right now until I meet the minister again.
Okay. Well, I'll ask, and we appreciate you giving us that response. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope that we've demystified a bit of what's happening with this new wave. Thank you.
Dr. Manza, thank you.
Thank you, folks.
All right.
We're about to take a break, and just before we come back, or when we come back, actually, we've got another heavy conversation to share with you. There's one thing to vie to actually be a minister, a minister in office, but there's another thing to having to want to be the leader of that party. Honorable Tracy Tega Panton will be sitting in with us when we come back.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.